Welcome all. Apologies for the delay. Just getting ourselves together here. Just going to break the room.
That's why they don't put it there.
We'll never be invited back. All right.
Actually, I'll move this away from you. The 1 or 2 inches made more important. Thanks.
Oh, that's new.
Oh, yeah.
My mic's always on.
All right. You know this is a lot to ask. Could you think very skinny thoughts for just a second?
I shall try my hardest.
Well, you know, you're already down that road, so.
Miss Creasy, can I have a pen if I find myself able?
Pen?
A pen.
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, I have one. Thank you.
Yeah, that's one. That's one.
Yeah.
Oh, he doesn't need a pen anymore?
No, I thought
As long as everyone has it.
I believe we are nearly in order here. Welcome all to the September 12th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting, regular meeting. I would like to start with Commissioner reports. Shortly.
Oh, yeah, there we go. Thanks.
Not quite there. I jumped the gun.
Yeah, I can go if you want me to go.
I would like you to. Thank you.
All right, got a couple of updates, and the first relates to LUPEC. I did not make the LUPEC meeting, but I did send you guys copies of the agenda and what they refer to as the minutes. It's more an agenda, but there is a link at the bottom of the minutes that kind of walks you through what the presentations look like. The Parks and Rec group did meet. A very, very busy group, as you well know. We got an update on Meadow Creek Palm, the golf course. Our golf course is a world-class golf course, one of the probably top 3 or 4 in the United States. Copied you guys on the update on that as well. But one thing to note about that is we did 49,000 rounds of golf last fiscal year. That is up by 6,000 rounds of golf over the prior fiscal year. So the golf course is back. I sent you guys a copy of our CIP request. Looks like we're going to be looking for about $3 million in new requests this fiscal year. And I copied you guys on that. The master plan RFP has been awarded, and it's been awarded to the organization that did the work for the county as well. Also copied you guys on a very interesting presentation regarding Bennett's Village. This is going to be Central Virginia's first truly accessible and inclusive space. It'll be in Penn Park. And it will be developed by a foundation, but will eventually be given to the city, and we will own it, and Parks and Rec will manage it.
Thank you. Mr. Duranzio.
I have a couple of things. HAC met for its regular meeting. The zoning ordinance was a topic of discussion, and some more conversation regarding the land bank, but mostly about how to go about looking at the land bank. We also had a special meeting specifically on the zoning office, the ADU portion of it, and the updated rate of change analysis.
Which ADU?
That would be the affordable dwelling units, not the accessory dwelling unit, ADU. In addition, a couple of other sort of secondary, this has been out since, I think, the very beginning of August, but notice of funding availability went out for HOPS, which is the operations portion of housing providing the CAF itself, CDBG and home, respectively. HOPS, the approximate funds available is about $575,000, the CAF $835,000. The CDGB is BG is about, and because home and CDBG is fuzzy, but it's about 410, and home is about 112. The latter two are not really going to be considered until early next year by the CDBG task force.
Thank you. Mr. Habab?
Thanks.
Oh, actually, in a follow-on to that,
Please.
I beg your pardon. Today, Office of Community Solutions, I believe, held a seminar, for lack of a better term, for the process of applying and writing up these requests for the funds. There's been discussion on both the task force and in the CAF and in the HAC regarding that we have several very well-established players and recipients, and that there are several organizations that are looking to get involved with providing housing specifically, and they are not really prepared for the process. So we are trying to level that playing field a bit with some seminars and colloquia and, learning sessions for that.
Thank you. Mr.
Yep.
Habab?
Thanks. So the nominating subcommittee for the planning election met to elect a new planning commission chair and vice chair. So without further ado, the chair is Commissioner Mitchell, and vice chair Commissioner Schwartz. If they have to accept, or are they forced to?
We cannot force them, but we certainly hope they might. We can consider that issue after commissioner reports are done.
And the tree commission met last week on September 7th. Quick highlights. The tree commission sent a letter to the planning commission with some comments regarding the specific items in the draft ordinance. I believe Missy distributed that to us all last Friday. There's still some back and forth on an RFP for the downtown tree replacement plan, but we're hoping to have something in place this fall. Work on combating invasives continues by our two contractors, Goat Busters and RX Fire. You might have seen them at Booker T. Washington Park. Their work is done there, and up next is Azalea, about 2 acres there, Forest Hills, 1.5 acres, and then Jordan Park to 5th Street Station, about 7.7 acres, starting by the end of the month. An inventory of trees planted this spring was completed, and we found about 12% mortality rate, which is actually great given our expected 20-25% due to extreme weather conditions this year. And Parks and Rec put out an RFQ for new tree installations to include about 160 trees distributed across Charlottesville, some in schools to replace recent removals, parks including Jenkins, McIntyre, Star Hill, Belmont, and Jordan Park, and several vacancies around town, possibly that small lot by Shenanigans if we want to make it a nice pocket park. And then Relief Seaville will be doing some major planting in Rose Hill neighborhood, about 100 trees total, including in Burley Middle School, CRHA site on Madison Street, and Washington Park. And lastly, Charlottesville Area Tree Stewards is installing over 20 trees at Reeves Park. That's it for me.
Thank you. Mr. Schwartz?
At the BAR meeting, At the BAR meeting in August, we discussed the Greyhound station. There's a hotel use that is considering the site. It was just a preliminary discussion, no decisions were made. And we also looked at, discussed how we're going to review our guidelines. So hopefully there'll be some progress on that coming up shortly.
Thank you. Mr. Stolzenberg?
We had a meeting of the MPO Tech Committee, mostly discussed at length the sort of thresholds for scoring in the long-range transportation plan that's upcoming, moving towards 2050. And that will be an ongoing discussion of exactly how to model the various needs of various road segments across the MPO area. We also discussed the ongoing debate at the Commonwealth Transportation Board about changes to the smart scale process, which are looking very unfavorable toward the city. So we'll see how that plays out as well. We'll be following it. MPO will be meeting monthly. MPO Tech will be meeting monthly until moving towards 2050 is complete. And then coming up later in September, we have our joint Campo and SAW MPO, the Stan Augusta Waynesboro MPO. We're meeting jointly with them in order to work on issues that affect both of our areas.
Thank you. Mr. Palmer?
I guess for my report, I'll just say there's a Board of Visitors meeting later this week. Items related to planning under consideration in that meeting are design approval for a central utility plant at the Fontaine Research Park, which is actually in the county, but just over the city line on Fontaine Avenue. That's all part of the larger redevelopment going on there. I'll get into that in just a second. And then there's another approval of a scoreboard at Scott Stadium, so a new, higher tech, larger scoreboard, so we can see all the replays better. And then schematic review, which means it's just for review, not being voted on in that meeting. They'll see the design for the Institute for Biotechnology, which is the large research building that central utility plant will power and give hot water and cold water to, as well as infrastructure and a parking garage that will also be there to support that, because we're building on an existing parking lot. We're adding employees there, so we're going to need more parking, and so there's a parking structure planned for that site. And then another smaller project that is under review is the Center for Politics, which is located off of Old Ivy Road, colloquially known as Montesano, I guess that's the name of the house. And they're doing like a kind of a pavilion edition on the back, so they can have larger colloquium and things of that nature, seminars and things. Yeah, so that's my report.
Thank you. As for me, I attended the October 5th meeting of the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission Board. Many issues were discussed, including rural internet progress. Most substantively, and I think most surprising to me, were the changes to the Smart Scale funding process, which I've spent some time trying to understand, and staff has been very patient with me. My understanding is that the number of projects that we will be able to submit per year will be reduced. There are some potential reductions in funding for bicycles and pedestrian safety, as well as some restrictions on where certain projects will be permitted, which are probably all. Oh, and also some potential changes to how different applicants will be judged based on their history, which is probably bad for us also. So troubling news to me. Staff is well aware. MPO is following this closely, hoping for good things for sure. That is what I have here. Turning to the Neighborhood Development Services. Where are you? There you are. Hello.
Hi. Sure. So we have some really busy times coming up here. Actually, we're in the middle of very busy times. So we are preparing for a public hearing for the development code and zoning map on Thursday, working through lots of logistics. We anticipate that we're going to have a lot of interested parties. So we're working to accommodate people both in person as well as virtual. And so we're going to have signups begin no earlier than 3:30. So please don't come to City Hall much earlier than that, because we're going to allow the other business to conclude and then move into that. Virtual participants will have the opportunity to raise their hand in the Zoom function, as we typically do. We will do some alternating between in-person and virtual participants. We're not sure if it's going to be a one-to-one, because there's a lot of time gap that ends up being lost between those transitions. So we're still trying to work with our logistics folks to try and make that as streamlined as possible. Just some simple math notes that we can accommodate no more than 30 speakers per hour. And that is on the very, very high end. And we anticipate that we have a lot of interested parties. So we're trying to make things as efficient as possible. We're going to ask the public or remind the public that each speaker, when you come forward on Thursday, we'll repeat this again then. You'll provide your name and address, and you'll have 2 minutes to provide feedback. You can't share your time with someone else. The 2 minutes is just yours. And each person is going to only be able to speak one time. So you choose to either speak in person or you speak virtually, not both. And please only sign up to speak in person or virtually. We are going to continue, all of us, we are planning to be here until everyone in the community who would like to speak to this has had their opportunity. We would like everyone to have that opportunity, and we want to make sure that we don't have, we have limited hiccups, and we can definitely do that if we have folks just signing up one time. So that's some preliminary logistics. We're working through additional items. Please bear with us. This is probably one of the largest hearings that we've been anticipating. I can't think in my over 20 years here, one this big potentially. And so we're doing the best we can logistically to try and make that as smooth as possible for both the community and the commissioners. And ultimately, when we have to do that again, when we work with our council to do that. So something to keep in mind, all of us. We also have some reserved times if the commission is not ready to provide a recommendation at the end of that hearing. We have reserved times that were on the mailings that went out to everyone, and we've already advertised for the September 19th to comply with meeting notice requirements, and we will wait and see what the results of that will be, but we do want folks to definitely everyone, I appreciate all the phone calls and communication that I've gotten from a number of individuals. It's been really fun to talk to people throughout the community and explain this process. It's not something that, well, many people in this room work in the land use world or in some aspect of it in their lives or their volunteering, but most people do not focus on land use on a daily basis. And so it's kind of fun to be able to start from ground zero and be able to help someone try and understand what's going on from this perspective. So that's been a really good opportunity as well. So we have the meeting Thursday. Everyone's going to be here. We're going to encourage you all, commissioners, to get here no later than 3:45 if possible so that we can get set up. Another thing, we are all humans as well, so we're going to take breaks every 2 hours during this hearing, and a little bit longer break at 8 o'clock for a little bit of nourishment. But again, we all want to keep moving efficiently through this process, and so, yeah. All right, I think that's all I have.
Thank you. Looking at the agenda, I see the item officer elections. This is my first officer election that I've participated in from this perspective. Ms. Creasy, could you guide me? What happens now?
Sure. So your nominating committee provided a nomination slate. Typically what happens next is you as chair will ask if there are any other nominations for either the chair or vice chair. And if there are any other nominations, we'll see if those individuals are interested in accepting that. If we have contested races, then we'll actually have votes that, go between candidates. I haven't experienced that. It could happen at any time. But if we just have our slate of officers that have been proposed by the nominating committee, then another member of the board can go ahead and vote to accept the nominating committee's recommendation.
Are there any nominations, please? Hearing none, I would suggest that we take a vote on the nominees. Do you accept? I should ask Mr. Mitchell, do you accept? Mr. Schwartz, do you accept? Thank you both. Ms. Creasy, would you please, I guess, do we need a motion?
Sure. Sounds
Sure.
like Mr. Duranzio might be able to do
something?
that for us.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I move that we accept the nominating committee's work and elect these people by acclamation and/or vote as is required.
What is required, Ms. Creasy?
I can call,
Please.
or yeah, let's do that then. It's cleanest. Oh, yes, and someone will need to second Mr. Duranzio's.
Oh, yes. Do I hear a second?
I second the motion.
Thank you.
All right, and I will call that for you. Mr. Schwartz,
Yes.
Mr. Duranzio,
Aye.
Mr. Stolzenberg,
Aye.
Mr. Habab,
Aye.
Mr. Mitchell,
Yes.
and Mr. Sully Yates.
Aye. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very, very much. Want to just take a moment to offer my congratulations to Mr. Sully Yates. You have moderated this board with finesse and patience, two traits that I like. So, so let's see what happens with that. The other thing, and you've done a lot. You've got a lot of things done. Two of the most important things you got done is you got council to vote yes on the comprehensive plan that we developed. The other thing that you got done is you got us to the red zone with the zoning ordinance. Now, the red zone, if you guys watch football this weekend, you know that the red zone is the most difficult part of the field to navigate. You often settle for a field goal, or maybe there's a turnover through interceptions, or turnover through a fumble, or maybe a turnover after 4 downs. We do not want to accept a field goal, and we absolutely cannot tolerate a turnover. Now, the bad news is you guys have a new quarterback. But the good news is we've got Mr. Sully Yates still here leading the charge and giving us his wisdom. And if I may mix metaphors, Mr. Sully Yates, let's land this plane. With that, Ms. Creasy, it is 6 o'clock. Would you like to move right into the public hearings, the regular public hearings, since we're going to be losing council? Or no, wait a minute. Do you want to move into that since we're going to lose council at 6:45 and then 7:30, or do you want to go ahead and do the ACRB and then
Well, I believe we're going to have a quorum of council through 7:45.
6:45 for Aaliyah?
Yes, and so
So
that
6:40,
is something we definitely want to keep in mind. We will have matters from the public still to occur, but that won't be specific to our public hearing items, and so we'll be able to cover that at a later part of the meeting, and then the consent agenda, which can occur later in the meeting. And concerning the public hearing item that we would be beginning soon, the entrance quarter item that is prior to that is related to that. And so one recommendation can be to have both staff members provide us with the guidance and the reports for those items. The first motion that will need to take place would be the special permit recommendation from the Entrance Corridor Review Board, because they will be providing guidance to the Planning Commission as they jump into the public hearing item. So from a motion standpoint, you all will have to start with that one, and then you can move into the other items. But for efficiency's sake, it would be okay if you all choose to hear all of the dialogue on the item as a whole and then move forward at that point in time.
Actually, what I'm gonna do is, when we get to it, I'm going to gavel us into the entrance corridor review and do that. I'll then gavel us out, and then I'll gavel us back into the public hearing for the SUP and the critical slopes.
That is a wonderful way to do it as well.
But my question to you is, what do you want to do now? Do you want to continue with the agenda, or do you want to, because we're losing people, move on to the public hearing or the SUP and I've got to do the ECRB first, don't we? We have
Right.
to do that first.
I think you would be okay to begin into the public hearing. Anyone who's going to speak from matters from the public, it'll be an item, not that item. And so we'll work through this item, and then after that, perhaps take up matters from the public, because other items on the agenda folks might want to speak to.
Okay. So why don't we do the ECRB first?
Okay.
Because we need to do that before we get to the SUP and the critical slopes.
Sure. Yes.
Okay.
If I may, what if there are matters, members from the public who'd like to speak on that item? Granted, it's largely the same item as the public hearing, but, they may have entrance corridor specific comments, which would have been covered by the not on the formal agenda comments. So should we have a public comment for that first?
Potentially. So the only question before us from the ERB standpoint, the Entrance Corridor Review Board standpoint, will be whether, concerning the effect of this project on the entrance corridor. Again, for clarity, the entrance corridor, if this application moves forward, the ERB will hear the actual application for the design part of the entrance corridor. But at this point, we're not into the details of the design. We're just clarifying that this would be in accordance on the front end, so that we don't start in a bad place.
All right, what I'm going to do then is I'm going to gavel us out of the Planning Commission, and I'm going to gavel us into the CRB review. So what we're being asked to do, this is relating to 1709 JPA. The question before us is, will this development be a detriment to the district? If it will be a detriment to the district, are there any mitigating actions that we might want to recommend that might make the detriment not as onerous? So I think Mr.
Warner.
Warner is managing this.
A couple things before I begin. One, I realize it's been over 3 years the BAR's been meeting in city space, and I always forget how much I hate this room. So, and I can say that as design staff. Second, so you all know, Carl has chaired several BAR meetings and done a wonderful job. So he'll do fine.
Hopefully, we'll never have to chair a planning commission meeting.
Third thing is, just Carl did mention the BAR design guidelines. Just let you all know when we get to, once we get past the zoning revisions, we will start talking to you all about the need to revise the entrance corridor design guidelines. So I want to encourage all of you to dust those off, start writing on them, making notes. I will get you copies if you want. That would be the helpful way to start. And then one last thing, sort of an order of business here, is that per the current code for entrance corridor, you all are supposed to annually select a chair and vice chair of the ERB. Given that tonight you've changed from the prior chair and co-chair, I don't know, and Ryan, you certainly advise if you think necessary to elect a chair and vice chair for the entrance corridor before we proceed. So.
I think we're going to forego that this evening, Mr.
enough.
Warner, and if we're able to have an expedited report, I think that would be helpful.
That would be it'll be quick. So I don't have a presentation for you all. I know the applicants here certainly can answer any questions you have. This is an ERB review of the special use permit request for 1709 JPA, and this parcel is within the Fontaine Avenue JPA entrance corridor. And per code, when there is a special use permit for property within an entrance corridor, council refers the application to the ERB for recommendations as to whether the proposed use will have an adverse impact on the corridor, and for any recommendations as to reasonable conditions which, if imposed, would mitigate those impacts. And as Ms. Creasy said, regardless of this SUP being approved or denied by council, any subsequent development of this lot would still require your review, your design review and approval of a COA. So quickly, 1709 JPA, it's a 0.3 acre parcel within subarea C of the Fontaine Avenue JPA entrance corridor. The parcel fronts on JPA to the east and Montebello Circle to the west. Currently on the site is a 4-story brick apartment building built in 1972. The building's set back about 66 feet from JPA. Available records indicate no buildings on this site prior to the existing apartments, and there is no historic designation associated with the site or the building. One interesting side note, this property was part of several hundred acres owned by John Perry, and in 1817, Perry sold a portion of his land, 196 acres actually, to the trustees of Central College, which of course became the University of Virginia. Perry built at the top of the hill behind this parcel. He built Montebello, and it's currently owned by the university, and it is on the Virginia Landmarks Register and National Register of Historic Places. But again, no associations relative to historic matters associated with the 1709. The SUP request, which you'll discuss later, proposes residential density be increased from 21 dwelling units per acre to 87, and with that will require allowing increased building height to 70 feet from 45, allowing a reduced setback from JPA from approximately 40 feet to 18 feet, allowing a reduced setback from Montebello Circle from approximately 40 feet to 25 feet, allowing a reduced side setback from 17.5 feet to approximately 5 feet, and specifically that would only be at the northeast corner to accommodate a portion of the building. Allowing a reduced off-street parking requirements from 38 spaces to 22, allowing a reduced minimum distance to low-density zoning from 75 feet to 58 feet, and allowing a reduced landscape buffer width at Montebello Circle from 25 feet to approximately 17 to 18 feet. And I can go through this, but in general, to all of these recommendations, design staff, and I'm speaking as design staff, not all staff, but our recommendation is a finding of no adverse impact on the corridor, and that includes for the SUP overall, the increased density. However, we don't review, to be clear, ERB doesn't review how a building is used, so whether this is 500 apartments or 5, it is the exterior design of the building that you review. Regarding the increase in height, again, recommend finding of no adverse impact. The visual and aesthetic impacts of the building's height, massing, and scale, staff suggests can be addressed and mitigated if necessary during the required design review process. Again, no finding of adverse impact on the other issues related to the SUP. And again, to keep things moving, overall, design staff recommends the following. In evaluating an SUP request, your job, the ERB's job, is to review and offer comment on only the impacts that will be visible from the entrance corridor. So you're not tonight evaluating this design. In fact, what has been presented is really conceptual. And staff suggests because the design review process will address and mitigate, if necessary, the visible elements of the project, that the SUP, as requested, will not adversely impact this entrance corridor. So I do not have any recommendations that would go with the SUP associated with the design, but I certainly, you all can tonight comment on, again, understanding that the design presented is conceptual, but if there are elements of that design that you think are strong and should be retained, or something that should be addressed, it's fine to bring that up tonight. You can also, if you have things that you feel are important relative to design and would like them included in the SUP, you can certainly raise them. But I think everything can be covered when this comes in for COA. And with that, any questions for me?
Next time. The applicant, is there anything the applicant would like to offer?
I think we'll wait until we.
Okay. All right, well, let's begin deliberations. Mr. Palmer, any thoughts?
On this matter?
Yeah.
I don't have too
Sorry.
many. It's pretty
Mr.
procedural.
Duranzi?
I guess since we're so early on, I don't really have a whole lot of thoughts about it.
Mr. Bob?
Yeah, same. I agree with staff's report.
Mr. Solietz?
I see tremendous potential for aesthetic enhancement, which is exciting.
Mr. Stolzenberg?
I agree it will be better than the old one. My one concern is on the garage entrance, which is not necessarily impacted by the SUP for height or density, so.
Mr. Schwartz?
I'm inclined to go with staff's recommendation on this.
Is there a motion?
I move to find the visual and aesthetic impacts of the requested SUP can be addressed during the required design review and therefore will not adversely impact the Fontaine Avenue, Jefferson Park Avenue entrance corridor.
Second.
Is there a second? Seeking voice acclamation, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The recommendation is on to council. The next thing on our list, Ms. Creasy, we want to go now back into where we are gaveling out of ECRB, and we're now back in the Planning Commission. We want to do the two 1709 items, is that right?
Yes, sir. And if you would ask the mayor if he could
Mr.
call
Mayor,
council
you
to
guys-
order, that'd be wonderful.
Are you in order?
Yes, we're supposed to officially declare a council meeting is in order, that we are in order, and all five of us are here, and we're listening to the public hearing.
And that's a wonderful thing.
Forthcoming.
All righty, so we've got two items relating to 1709. The first is an SUP application. The second is a critical slopes waiver. We will talk about them both together. That is, we will have we'll have Mr. Alfley's presentation. We'll have the applicant presentation. We will have we'll have a public hearing. But we will then deliberate on them separately because we'll need a separate vote on the SUP and a separate vote on the critical slope waiver. So, Mr. Helpsley.
Chair, thank you. Matt Alfley, City Planner, Neighborhood Development Services. Planning Commission, tonight you will be holding a public hearing for a requested special use permit at 1709 Jefferson Park Avenue and making two recommendations to City Council, one related to the special use permit and one related to a critical slope waiver. Mitchell Matthews and Associates, representing the owner, Neighborhood Investments LLC, is proposing an SUP at 1709 JPA for increased density, additional height, modifying yard requirements, and modifying on-site parking requirements. You previously heard these requirements in the last presentation, so I won't go through them just for time's sake. The applicant is making these proposals as part of a request to redevelop the property and replace the existing 8-unit multifamily apartment building with a 27-unit multifamily apartment building. As part of the redevelopment plan, they are requesting an increase in density from 21 dwelling units per acre to 87 dwelling units per acre per section 34-420. Plus the changes to setback and height as previously reported in the entrance corridor review. The subject property is also relatively small, and the existing building and supporting infrastructure, parking, walkways, retaining walls, and et cetera, already impact the majority of the critical slopes on site. Most of these existing impacted critical slopes are on the sides of the property. The proposed development would expand the footprint of the building with a new building and disturb virtually 100% of the critical slopes on site. In general, staff recommends approval of the SUP request and the critical slope request but with modifications to the parking and screening requirements along Montebello Circle as outlined in the staff report, which in part the report states, according to the city's future land use map, the JPA corridor is anticipated to go through a significant change in the coming years based off the stated goals of the plan. These goals include more intense mixed-use development within 5 to 8-story buildings. Staff is not concerned with the massing and scale as it relates to JPA or the properties abutting the site, but staff is concerned with how the building will transition from the more intense residential aspects of JPA to the smaller scale characteristics of Montebello Circle. Staff believes the entrance corridor guidelines will help mitigate the impact of the building, but suggests removing the parking for the development off Montebello Circle and increasing the screening. Staff suggestion would be for an 18 feet of S3 screening along 90% of Montebello Circle's frontage. This would allow for more screening but leave some room for pedestrian access to the building. This concludes staff's presentation on the SUP report. The applicant has prepared a presentation and also has some concerns with one of staff's recommendation 11, related to the LID worksheet, which staff and the applicant can address as you deliberate. But with that, I will turn it over to the applicant for presentation. Both staff and the applicant are available for
Let's
questions.
see if any of your friends up on the dais have any questions.
Yes.
Mr. Palmer, any questions?
No questions.
Mr. Durancio?
No, sir.
Mr. Bob?
I have a question. Based on the staff report, did I read correctly? There's no indication of how they're tackling the affordable housing requirement, right? They haven't chosen yet.
They haven't chosen. They need to either provide 3 units or pay in lieu.
Okay, thank you.
My only question is about the LID issue, which is fine later or now.
And we don't have OCS here to clarify on that worksheet, do we? I guess I'm confused how 1,600 square feet is 3 units when it's it's about 1,700 gross square feet per unit in building size.
Yeah, I mean, all I can do is reference to what was the Office of Community Solutions analysis.
Okay, and then one question on the S3 screen condition. I know in S3 screens there's like an option to do an opaque wall or fence. Do we feel like the condition, because it says landscaping, I think, precludes that, or do we think that's an acceptable option, or?
It would depend on the site plan, but by doing S3 screening, that at least is an option if there is something that would work as an opaque wall.
Okay.
That option is not available in the S1 or S2 screening.
Okay, thanks.
So one of the conditions was to remove the 3 parking spaces from the upper portion of the site. Is that going to reduce the number of units that they can get or that they can achieve?
I'll let the applicant speak to that as far as the viability of the parking. It's just, and getting into that, staff's concern is the way you would have to park those is you'd have to back in because you cannot back out onto a public city street. So that makes a weird parking, and staff would just like to see a better transition to the lower density neighborhood.
Okay.
All right, I think we are ready for the applicant.
Greetings to members of the commission, members of the council. My name is Kevin Riddle. I work at Mitchell Matthews Architects. I'm here with John Matthews. We also have Campbell from Timmons Group. He's the civil engineer who's overseeing this project. And those guys will hopefully be here to field any questions that I can't cover. Allow me to make a brief presentation, sort of introduction to the project for you. As Matt described, and thanks, by the way, to Matt and Jeff for their thorough reports, the project is asking for a special use permit based on several criteria: additional density, additional height, yard reductions, parking reduction, and a reduced distance to low-density zone. I'll touch on those criteria more as I get deeper into the presentation. And now the next slide, please, Patrick. Here is a first effort we made at doing a calculation of what would be required of this project under current ordinance for an affordable housing contribution. The owner prefers a fee in lieu to satisfy the affordable housing contribution. And this calculates that fee. We realize the city is currently reevaluating the fee method and amount as a part of a potential new ordinance. However, the draft ordinance is still a work in progress, and it's still unclear to us right now, where that fee calculation will land. So this is what we have to present at the moment. We understand there's likely to be conversation about this later, and we can discuss this later. We're glad to. And the next slide. Here, just to orient you quickly, is the site as viewed from the air. It has double frontage. On its west front yard is Montebello Circle, and on its east front yard is Jefferson Park Avenue. UVA is to the north, very close, and an easy walk away. A city bus stop is even closer to the site. And the next slide. Here we have the site with the current zoning ordinance overlaid. And here I'll talk briefly about the request for additional density. The 87 DUA proposed here falls within the range that can be requested with an SUP. And the corridor has been identified by the city for a long time as a location where increased housing and thus density makes sense. There's a long history of multifamily housing here, much of it accommodating UVA students who live off campus. The existing building at 4 stories has 8 apartments, yet current by right density limits will allow no more than 6 apartments. So it's already it's out of compliance with by right zoning. And yet in this 4-story structure, the structure only occupies about 20% of the site. So we feel like the site would be significantly underutilized if it was redeveloped as a by right project under current zoning. And then when you consider the potential adoption of the draft ordinance, density limits would not be imposed in this zone. So we think the request is consistent with the vision of the future here. Now if we go to the next slide. And here is the site embedded in the draft zoning map. You can see that the city's direction is to allow, perhaps encourage, higher densities and expanded land use for properties along the corridor. In fact, you'll notice since we prepared this page, the map has actually been revised yet again. So if you look up at the top of the map, over to the left of JPA, on the other side of Woodrow Street, just below, the proposal is now that what is called CX5 on this map would actually go to CX8. And so an even higher density zoning has actually, in the intervening months, at least as proposed, has expanded downwards so that it's now just one property removed from the host site at 1709 JPA. And the next slide. Here's the survey of the site. You know that the yard at Montebello is significantly higher by about 54 feet, so around 5 stories taller than it is on JPA. It's a very steep site. There are critical slopes. They lace the property, as they do many of the properties on this side of the street. And we just see that there would be no way forward to develop any new building here without a waiver of the critical slopes. All right, and the next slide. In the following sheets, we just have photographs of surrounding buildings. To accommodate more housing, the trend has been in this corridor to build multifamily structures 4 stories and taller. If you consider 1725 JPA, 1707 JPA, 1600, and 1620 JPA, they were all erected in the last 15 years. They all stand 4 stories and taller. And the next slide. These are just more of the properties along the JPA corridor close to 1709. And the next slide. Here we are looking at properties that are up on Montebello, close to the property. What you'll see is a kind of a difference between properties that are on the west side, opposite our side of the street, and the east side. The properties on the west side typically have very deep front yards. They have ample trees and planted screening, and they also sit at elevations well above the street. On this side of the street, where 1709 is located, the buildings typically sit very low. They're lower than the elevation of the circle generally, and so are their front doors. And on this side, parking in front yards is very common. In fact, I would say a majority of the properties on this side have parking that goes from one side of the other in the front yards. And the next slide. Now we start looking at the proposal. This is a view of the building's rooftops and the surrounding site. At JPA, the steep expanse of concrete paving is replaced instead by 3 trees, an entry plaza with built-in seating, concealed trash storage, and a single entry drive with access to underbuilding parking. At Montebello, instead of blacktop paving across the entire width and the deteriorating structural remnants of a deck, there would be 5 trees, planting beds, and a walk to the Montebello entrance, plus 3 parking spaces. This reduces parking on the street by half of the current total. It also allows a pull-off area potentially for delivery vans. We also show, you'll notice at F, the potential for a green roof, and at the letters G, potential for biofilters. We've not yet determined the best way forward here, whether it would be one or the other, whether it would be some combination of the two to help satisfy the low impact worksheet. But our team, led by Campbell, is committed to getting to at least the 10 points on that worksheet using some combination of these, possibly counting parking reductions depending on whether city staff agrees that that's appropriate. And the next slide, please. This is just images of the potential plantings on the site. We've tried to pick trees that would be larger, closer to the street, like the Kentucky coffee tree. They're all trees that are on the city's recommended list. Most of them would present with very nice fall color. And the next slide. Here are 2 plans. So we thought these 2 plans were good to kind of pull from the model because they are the plan levels where the building connects to each street, at each front yard. So the plan on the left is the building level where it meets with Jefferson Park Avenue. This is the parking level. You can see the entry drive leading to the parking under the building. That's where we have 19 spaces. On the right, we have the apartment level where it connects to Montebello Circle. This is where there would be a second entrance into the building and exit from it. And we currently do propose that there might be 3 parking spaces preserved here, but with a much better combination of plantings and walks to replace what is currently mostly blacktop. And the next slide. Here we see just some comparisons. On the left is our white boxes, both in plan and section. They just represent areas in which somebody might propose a building, and on the left is what you can have by right. On the right is what could potentially be allowed based on the current draft ordinance. There have been a few small changes since we prepared this slide, but it's still very close to what you find in the language in that ordinance. In the middle is, that represents our proposal, that our building will be located basically within the bounds of the white boxes, both in section and plan. And the next slide. Here we have a section that gives you, we hope, a better impression of what the building would be like relative to some of its neighbors on either side of the street. You see that we have calculated an average grade by the city's current calculation method, and based on that average grade, we're proposing a building that's about 70 feet tall, 70 feet above that grade. We know that when people are looking at this project from Jefferson Park Avenue, they would count and they would say this is an 8-story building. But we would say you could decide just as well to stand on Montebello and look at the building, in which case you'd count and you'd say it's a 4-story building. So that's one of the reasons why we have tended to stress in our materials that we consider it a 70-foot tall building, because the extreme grades and the 2 front yards really offer very different impressions depending on where you're taking in this building. We think it's fine that the building does present taller on JPA. We think it's consistent with increasingly taller buildings that provide more housing along the corridor. And then when we go to Montebello, we think it's appropriate that the building gets to about 4 stories tall, with an upper story that has a significant step back. We think that's generally in keeping with what's on the circle. There are several 3-story buildings there already. And if we go to the next slide. We'll just go through the elevations quickly. They're there for reference if people want to come back to them. This is the elevation on Jefferson Park Avenue, and next. This is the elevation on the northeast side. Next. The elevation on Montebello, and next. And this is the elevation as we come around on the other side. Now we go to the next slides, which will show the site, photographs of the existing site. There you see the concrete paving that's there at the front of the property, quite steep and hospitable. Trash cans are often left out there. The curb cuts, you have not only 2 cuts, but they're close enough together. You see there's really no availability for parallel parking on the street in front of the property as it currently is. Now if we go to the next slide. Here we see it standing in the front yard of the 1620 Jefferson Park Avenue apartment project. That's where Valley Road converges with JPA. And on to the next slide. So at this vantage, you can see our proposal and some of the virtues that we think it can offer, most notably just the way the whole connection to the street in the public realm would be altered. We have an entry court. We have built-in seating. That entry court connects to a lobby. And then above that lobby is a space that would be set aside as a kind of student lounge and commons area. And we think that could be helpful there where it sits on the street to have this more open, more heavily glazed storefront where you have common uses in the apartment as opposed to bedrooms and kitchens, and that those face out onto the street at the location where pedestrians would enter the project. To the left of the entry court is that driveway that would lead into the parking under the building. And if you look to the right at 1707 JPA, you see a project that has taken a similar strategy. That building was constructed in 2007, and you can see already there, by the way, what has happened with simply 2 sycamore trees and a smaller birch tree, that within 15 years, the screening and the canopy has developed to some size. And we would anticipate that there would be the same outcome on our property within 10 or 15 years. Next slide, please. This is just another vantage from across JPA. We'll go to the next slide. And here is the project taking the place of the existing building. We have the 2 large coffee trees proposed on either side of the driveway. And we anticipate here too, because that driveway is going to replace the 2 curb cuts, it'll be somewhere between 22 and 24 feet wide. It would give the city the potential to reclaim 2 parking spaces on the street. And the next slide, please. This photo is taken from the JPA medium. It's roughly across from the front of the 1707 project. As you can see from this angle, the paving in the front yard, I'm sorry, I lost my place here. Basically, the concrete there, if you look at the picture, you notice there's some small site stairs that lead up to the project. That's how tenants get up to the building. And on a day with snow and ice, it would be simply hazardous to negotiate between the sidewalk and the stair. And furthermore, even though that's devoted so much to parking now, you rarely even see a lot of cars parked there because it is, even in a car, hard to get up there. It's just a really, really tough and lousy condition right now. And the next slide. We think this slide is somewhat important too because it gives you the impression that we often have buildings on streets. We're not always far away from them, set back from them. In fact, we often are walking up the street. And you can see that in this case, you have a lot of existing trees and screening that would be there, already there, in addition to proposed new trees. And so it's really, the connection to the building happens to happen basically closer to the street level, with much of the building at upper story is largely obscured. And here you can see that the site is getting leveled off quite a bit. And more important than it being easier for cars to get onto the site, it's very easy now, or would be very easy now, for people to enter the site on foot or on bike. All right, the next slide, please. Here we are on the Montebello side. Have kind of the opposite condition here in a way, or a flip of it. If we go to the next slide, Patrick. You can see here the paving, instead of rising precipitously up toward the project, it goes down in a hurry. You see the angle those cars are parked at. So again, we feel like it's a situation that's kind of potentially dangerous, in addition to being kind of ugly. You see also that we have the large beams in red there that extend back to the building. They once supported a deck. It's just not an exemplary project on this side. Now we go to the next slide. And here we have it with the proposed building. We think that this would be a big improvement. Not only do we have the plantings there, we have a dedicated pedestrian walk that leads to the front door. And when it comes to the reduction of the distance between the lower density district, what we have on the other side of the street right now is, I believe, an R2 zone. This project is in an RX3. So currently the zoning would require us, with a building of this size and density, to preserve 75 feet between this building and the property across the street. And we just think that this part of the current ordinance is a byproduct of kind of unfortunate mid to late 20th century zoning priorities, ones that were focused on isolating detached single any other kind of housing. But we feel optimistic that most urban, as opposed to suburban settings, benefit from a better tradition of apartment buildings and smaller houses that are sometimes built in close proximity to each other. I mean, you see it in many places already in Charlottesville, from the Rugby Road neighborhoods to North Downtown. The city's proposed zoning aspirations, as reflected in the draft zoning, do not envision imposing such significant separations between lower and higher density dwelling types. And we think, therefore, that this request makes sense, as it allows the building to accommodate more housing while still preserving a front yard with much improved plantings and pedestrian access. Now when we get to the landscape buffer on this side that Matt spoke to, this is where we acknowledge that our request involves some compromise. I mean, absent any other considerations, we see where Matt and his team's recommendations are coming from. We agree, again, absent other considerations, that it would be great to have more street trees on this side and to plant the entire Montebello yard from side to side. But we do have other considerations that we want to bring up, and one is deliveries. I think the staff report envisions deliveries occurring only on the JPA side, but realistically, we think inevitably there will be some percentage of vans that will come up Montebello. And the modest curb cut we have here that allows these 3 parking spaces will also allow enough room for a smaller delivery vehicle to pull off of the street and get out of the way of traffic behind it. Another consideration is the site as it is. If we go back to the previous site again, I mean, not only is almost the entire Montebello yard currently a parking lot, but the paving here runs steeply down, it's inhospitable, potentially unsafe conditions are here. And it's also true if you look at the rest of the street. Parking that goes from side to side on properties is pretty common. By my count, there are about 30 spaces in front yards among the 7 properties that are on this side of Montebello. And so while we recognize what the city staff would like to see here with a fully planted, fully screened yard, we feel like leaving a few spaces here still gives us a much better site than what is typical, not just of the existing site, but its neighbors, while still allowing the owner some convenience of parking closer to upper-level apartments and the potential to allow a little more ease of deliveries. And if we go to the next slide, and the next one. Here we just tried to emphasize the open space, our outdoor amenity space requirements that we want to be sensitive to. We think these provisions in the draft ordinance make a lot of sense, and our proposal is consistent with them. And the next slide. And this is just to more fully explain the conditions, not only on the site, but around the site. The site has only 2 crepe myrtle trees right now. They would be lost, but we feel like what we're proposing in their place is a much better outcome. As you get closer to the site boundaries, I know there were some concerns, I think, expressed in our informal meeting some months ago, but we don't see too much to worry about there. At the top of the site, there's a mulberry tree, there's a cluster of paradise trees. They're generally considered undesirable trees. We don't anticipate that this project would harm them, but if it did, I don't think that's a problem. The tree at sea is dead already. And then down at the bottom of the site, the closest tree to the site is the birch tree, and we would do our utmost to make sure that that tree was not harmed during construction. And that's my presentation. I'd welcome questions and comments.
Ms. DePalma.
Let's see. Comments or questions? Right?
Questions and points.
Questions. Currently, do you know, and maybe this is more of a city question, can residents of that building get a Montebello Circle parking decal?
Yeah, I'll have to let Matt cover that one.
No, development of this size would not be eligible to get parking, on-street parking.
And it appeared from the renderings or the before pictures, there's currently no sidewalk on Montebello Circle on that side of the street.
That's right.
But you would be adding your section of the sidewalk for that.
We'd be adding a section where there are not parking spaces. You'll notice too that the Montebello side of 1707 next to it, it has a kind of potential delivery pull-off where often there end up being a couple of cars parked. And it does have a somewhat negligible little walk there. But when I was looking at that property, this one, and then some that are further south of it, I understood what city staff was mentioned in their report. Well, maybe a sidewalk on this side is not needed, and grade situations would make it difficult to pull off. On the other hand, I think you could ask, well, what if other properties did something like this one, and they reduced their parking by at least half? Then we would go to 29 or 30 parking spaces in the front yard, down to 14 or so. And then if what was not parking in those yards became sidewalk, then you could start to imagine some sidewalk on this side getting pieced together, which wouldn't be insignificant. While there is a sidewalk on the north side of Montebello, it's pretty narrow. Mm-hmm. There's cars parked there. Montebello's one way and it's quite narrow. And if you ever go up there, you'll see just naturally students and other residents, they kind of walk right down the middle of the street in many cases. So to provide a little more sidewalk on the other side, I know it would take a while, but that could be a real helpful outcome. And so we could see there being some virtue in doing something like we're proposing. We're not able to have a sidewalk run continuously from side to side, but we do introduce one where there is not a curb cut for parking.
Yeah, I think that makes a bit of sense. One other question. I couldn't tell on the site plan, and I probably asked this the last time. Is there an exterior stair egress from like the JPA level up to Montebello, or is that on the site? Is that only through the building?
It's only through the
Okay.
building. Yeah.
I wasn't sure. Comments wise, I'll try to be, as brief as I can. I think, obviously it's a great location for student housing. We're seeing more and more of it there.
Why don't you hold that until we get into...
Okay, just go through questions now?
Yeah.
Perfect, yeah.
Mr. D'Arancio.
Yeah. Let me preserve and come back to me.
Okay. Quick question on the spaces, the 3 spaces. I'm not sure if this falls to either staff or you, but would it be better to mirror them, or is that a possibility so they're not backing in, but you're nosing into the spots?
I'm sorry, say that again.
If you mirror the parking spots and the planting, so that you're nosing into the spots instead of having to back into them, would that alleviate some
Well,
steps?
that was actually based on a recommendation we had from city engineering in our pre-application meeting. What they wanted us to do, if we were going to propose spaces up here, initially we had them as just perpendicular, but they felt it would be safer actually if people going one way on Montebello did have to back into the spaces, because that would be a safer situation than having to back out of them on the one-way street. So that was the reason we angled them the way we did.
Okay. Would you consider a loading zone? I can save this to later also, but if you substituted a loading zone for parking spaces, if loading was the main driver for having something back there?
You know, that is a good question. I don't know if, John, you have any position there?
John Matthews, we think the parking is better for the community, better for the project, better in every respect. But if you felt that a loading area was better than a parking, we could look at that.
That's all my questions for now.
No questions, thank you.
On your, I think it was your second or third to last slide, showing the front, is that a level sidewalk that I see on your curb cut?
Yeah, what we're proposing at the moment, and we hope this remains a part of the project, is to have the where you have an entry to the drive, the paving to be slightly elevated and striped so that it is more friendly to pedestrians. It imposes a kind of slowdown on anybody who's driving a car and just makes that crossing point stand out more.
What's your worry that it wouldn't stick around?
Well, you know, I don't know. I mean, we realize we are going to be pursuing, if this project were recommended for SUPs and approved, we would still have to engage the entrance review process. And at that time, I think we could then kind of zero in more specifically on some of the details in the design, including that one.
Do you have a problem with it being conditioned?
I don't think we do. That where you enter the underbuilding parking off of JPA, that curb cut, that would be sort of elevated to sidewalk height.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Just say, I've been in this wheelchair a month, and I've been on some curb cuts with that cross slope that make me want to throttle the architect that decided to put it in. And, you don't want to be throttled, do you?
You'd have to catch him first. So I guess if you're willing to put the loading zone in, I guess that means that those 3 parking spaces are not vital to your unit count? Is that?
Yeah, I don't think they're vital, you know, to the unit counts. I mean, we're asking for a reduction as it is in parking. But, you know, the owner just wanted to get, you know, we basically found as much parking as we could under the building. And he felt he still wanted to find a few more spaces. And we convinced him that, you know, you can't just keep this whole front yard covered in parking spaces. So we ended up finding this compromise of 3. Yes, I mean, the project could, you know, certainly conceivably go forward, but it just might make it a little tougher, you know, where the marketing's concerned, you know, because there's just fewer spaces available.
And I apologize if you covered this when maybe I was scrambling to look at a piece of code or something, but did you talk to your email you sent us about the LID agreement? Did you mention that in your presentation?
I didn't talk about it specifically. I don't know if Campbell, you would like to just feel in conversation.
Because it sounds like we
regarding
need
this.
to change one of the conditions.
Yeah, and I guess in addition to that condition, obviously, if we're talking about the parking spaces, versus a loading zone and the extent of the planting buffer, there would be a few other conditions that would potentially need revision as well to account for those things, depending on where the conversation goes here, I think.
I'm just going to mention one thing just for, as Planning Commission is deliberating this, just for time, still the public hearing aspect of this with having quorum from City Council.
Thanks. Sorry.
Would you like me to answer a question on that request?
I mean, I guess you sent us an email, and I just want to make sure that if we need to change a condition, if we're going to accept the email that you sent us.
What's different? What are you asking us?
So the condition specifically says the LID spreadsheet points out you will use shared parking and green roof or bioretention. We want the opportunity to get 10 points on the spreadsheet with potentially some combination of them all, and not shared parking being a requirement of one of them. Because we haven't worked that agreement out with city staff and aren't sure we can get that approved. So we don't want the approval of that shared parking to be, hold the project up. So our revised condition said we will get 10 points with some combination of these, but not necessarily specifically shared parking.
So, Mr. Helfley, what do I think?
This is kind of why I was pointing out to the public here, because we could talk about this for a while, definitely during deliberation. I just didn't want to take away time from the public hearing aspect.
All right, we'll get back to that then. Thank you, Mr. Helfley. Before I go to council, you really didn't talk much about the critical slope. Is there anything else that you'd like to highlight on that beyond what's in the report?
Nothing beyond what's in the report. Staff felt these critical slopes were not necessarily man-made, but they weren't really that important as far as the existing conditions that the slopes are in, related to not a lot of tree plantings, and that there's already a building kind of in the smack middle of the critical slopes.
Mr. Pinkston, any questions for the applicant?
No, I have nothing more.
Vice Mayor Wade.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I'm glad that, the parking and things like that's been addressed. What I'm often get, complaints about is bikes and scooters and things like that. I couldn't see on the plan if there's a place in the front or easily accessible where the residents could, just scoot up their bikes or scooters and things like that.
Yeah, scooters is a good question. Bicycles, we are going to offer ample storage for the bikes within the building. With scooters, we don't have any part of the site set aside devoted to their parking right now.
Well, we're working on, getting docking stations and things like that, but, with this many residents, I know a lot of them are going to take the VOs or whatever there and they'll leave them on the sidewalk and people won't be able to get around in their wheelchairs. Anyway, so I'm just...
No, it's a good point, and actually, to improve the JPA side to allow for the sidewalk to remain clear, there probably is room to the left of that entry drive for us to slightly revise the planting bed for the coffee tree and that access area that would lead to the enclosed trash area to provide at least some room for scooters to be parked out of the way off the sidewalk.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor.
How many human beings live there right now?
Live there right now. I believe the 8 apartments are 2 bedrooms, and so 16.
That's all the question I have.
In that vein, I'm seeing some disagreement from some members of the audience to that point. But to that point, is it known whether for the new units, would those be 1, 2, 3, 4 bedrooms?
Their combination is currently proposed. The 27 apartments would have, I believe, between 64 and 67 bedrooms. And so there are some 4-bedroom apartments. There's a few 3s. There's a number of 2-bedroom and 1-bedroom apartments as well.
Okay. A few questions for staff. I know the applicant made reference to 7 stories, but staff's calculations from JPA, this would be an 8-story building, correct?
Let me just double check real quick. I believe that is correct. Yes, from JPA.
Okay. And I know there was a reference made to the future land use map. I know it could still change, but at least in the published documents available on the city's website and the interactive land use map, it's currently CX5 in the draft zoning. And that would allow up to 7 stories with an affordable housing bonus, correct?
That's correct, yes.
So the applicant is asking for, in addition to what would be allowed under CX5, and their affordable housing calculation in terms of payment in lieu does not factor in the draft affordable housing bonus or the draft inclusionary zoning ordinance, correct? That calculation is just the existing ADU ordinance?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, when we're talking about the draft ordinance versus the current ordinance, I think what we'd want to emphasize is that we've referenced the draft ordinance because we think it's a pretty good reflection at the moment, generally, of what the city's priorities are. And we'd also add that we think that it's important for our project to anticipate those and to generally be consistent with the priorities in that ordinance, which we think they are. But it is true that when it comes to certain specific areas, it's a little unknown at this point exactly how well it would jive with it. And so it's still a project that we think first and foremost is one where we're just pursuing an SUP based on the existing ordinance. And regarding the height, we can request up to 101 feet. We're not requesting that high. We understand that, for some people it looks pretty tall from JPA, but we think that the housing it will provide is a consideration that compensates for that.
Yeah, and I understand the situation you're in, but for Planning Commission and City Council's deliberation, continue to have a lot of heartburn about the future land use map being a justification for approval with being selective about what is in it and excluding the affordable housing height bonus as well as the inclusionary zoning ordinance. But that's it for questions for me.
All right, Ms. Creasy, I think I'm going to open up the public hearing. Would you be good enough to moderate that?
Sure, no problem. All right.
No, she's gone. She's gone.
I can't tell.
Can't see it.
She's
Never
gone.
mind.
All right, so as we have continued to do in our meetings where we have a virtual versus in addition to an in-person audience, what we will do is we will start with in-person individual. We had sign-up sheets, but we've just returned back to sign-up sheets, so it's okay if no one signed up. It's all good. We're going to let everyone have an opportunity. And we'll alternate between in-person and virtual participants for speaking as long as we have those who are interested in speaking. So we'll begin with someone in our in-person audience. Everyone's going to have 3-minute opportunity to speak, and if you provide your name and address for the record, that would be wonderful. So if you want to speak, we'll raise hand. This nice lady here will begin. If you could come up to the microphone so that we can record it properly, that would be wonderful.
Hello, I'm Ellen Contini Morava from 225 Montebello Circle in the Jefferson Park Avenue neighborhood. We've lived in our house for 35 years, and we raised our children there. I'd like to say something about the SUP application for 1709 Jefferson Park Avenue, which would have a frontage on Montebello Circle across the street from us. The proposed building would not be harmonious with the immediate neighborhood if that includes the single-family homes on the west side of our narrow street. It would also be taller than any of the other multi-unit buildings on the west side of JPA. The building next door to the subject property, 1707 JPA, is 4 stories tall, but only 1 story projects up on the Montebello Circle side. The tallest building on that side of JPA is 1725, toward the other end of Montebello Circle, 6 stories tall, but only 3 stories project up onto Montebello Circle. The proposed building would project 4 stories up on Montebello Circle, taller than any other building on that side of the street. This height difference isn't shown very clearly in the architect's drawing. The current version of the future land use map proposes to designate the west side of JPA CX5, which would allow a maximum of 5 stories, with a bonus of up to 7 stories if affordable housing would be included. The structure would be taller than even the maximum allowable by the proposed rezoning, and it would include no affordable housing as far as we can tell. As acknowledged by the staff report, the building would not conform to form and height requirements along JPA. Even though the proposed rezoning would allow up to 8 stories at, quote, key intersections, the staff report points out that the subject property is not located at an intersection, and restricting the height to 5 stories should be considered. Quote, that's a quote. This application is another example of how developers are scrambling to exploit the current special use permit process to add height and density to their projects that go beyond what current zoning would allow by right, without having to include any affordable units, which they would have to do if the proposal for inclusionary zoning are implemented. The city's inclusionary zoning analysis mentions extra height, density, and reduced on-site parking as bonuses that are meant to encourage developers to include some affordable housing. Why award bonuses to the developers without the gain of affordable units that are supposed to be the justification for them? Filling up our neighborhood with high-rises comes at a cost. Adding to the current traffic and parking congestion, loss of tree canopy, more broadly, loss of a sense of community for residents. We hope you'll seriously consider the suggestion from the city staff report to restrict the height to 5 stories rather than 8.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to check in on our virtual audience. If you're in our virtual audience and you're interested in speaking, please raise your hand in the Zoom application. We don't have anyone on by phone, but if someone was on by phone, they would hit *9, and that would allow them to raise their hand in the function. I don't see any hands raised in the virtual meeting, so I will go back to our in-person meeting. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Ann Benham. I live in the JPA neighborhood on Observatory Avenue, a few blocks from Montebello Circle, and I often walk in the neighborhood and on Montebello Circle. What I mainly want to say right now is I know Ellen Contini-Morava to be a community member that Charlottesville should be proud to have. She has worked for many years for the university. She speaks with a lot of reason and balance. She has done a lot of research. And I encourage every member of the Planning Commission and the City Council to please weigh and consider her words carefully. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I don't see any hands raised in our virtual audience, so I'll check with our in-person again. Pam?
Good evening. I'm Jennifer King, resident at 221 Montebello Circle. I'm here tonight to speak against approving the SUP. As I've stated in comments submitted in the past related to increasingly dense projects in the JPA neighborhood, I'm not opposed to increased density, nor to supporting growth. However, I believe the increases should be considered in the context of the entire neighborhood. It seems that the Planning Commission has determined that the JPA neighborhood should become a student ghetto and supports developing it as such. However, the rezoning process seems to suggest support for a diversity of populations and housing types throughout the city. I continue to struggle with understanding how it is appropriate to make an exception in the JPA neighborhood to what is considered good planning for the rest of the city. I've also heard as part of the rezoning process that there should be an appropriate buffer between different levels of zoning. I don't believe that improving an 8-story building across the street from a single-family home and reducing the buffer is an appropriate buffer. Since I believe the prevailing winds of change, particularly with respect to the JPA neighborhood, are not in my favor, I specifically ask that if you were to approve this SUP, you consider 2 things. 1, not providing any parking for the development on Montebello Circle, and enforcing the fact that those residents should not have parking permits on Montebello Circle, because in fact, today, they do. 2, restrictions on property tax increases for single-family homeowners who would like to remain in their homes. It seems to me that the Planning Commission and the city are of a mind that bringing more people to live in the city will encourage fewer cars and less car traffic. Allowing developers to develop properties with fewer on-site parking spaces seems to favor this opinion. Therefore, logic would dictate that if it's acceptable to not have cars on site of the property being developed, they should also not be permitted to park on the street surrounding the property. If you really believe in the utopia you're attempting to create, then your policies should support that. I don't have time to research the hard data, but I can state from walking around data that there certainly aren't fewer cars on my street than there were in the past decade. In fact, there are substantially more cars on my street than in the past decade. The most recent development impacting our neighborhood was approved at 1707 JPA. There was supposed to be a handicapped parking spot behind the building. Within 6 months of development, that turned into 2 parking spaces no longer handicapped. Additional parking lots and spaces on Montebello Circle around this development should be eliminated in lieu of walkable sidewalks or simply allowing enough space for the pedestrian, bike, scooter, and car traffic, which already exists. With respect to property taxes, I'm hopeful that you've done the math and realize that the proposed zoning changes will increase land values substantially, particularly in neighborhoods like JPA where you're proposing high intensity zoning. The value of my almost 100-year-old home will be irrelevant compared to the value of my land to a developer. The increased tax rates for single-family homeowners will drive out the middle-class citizens living in this area. Should we choose to remain in our homes, we should not be punished by the decisions of our own city government. Thank you.
All right. No other participants in our virtual audience, so lady in the black shirt.
Hi everyone, I'm Chloe Kinsley. I am a resident of 1709 JPA. This is my 2nd year living in the building, and I only got involved in this issue on August 24th when a sign went up in my yard. And I read the Signal every week, but I had never heard of this project happening, so I wanted to get involved, and so I talked with Ellen, and I really trust her judgment, and I think that she's a very valuable voice to consider in this issue. I moved to Montebello for 2 reasons. I'm from Charlottesville, by the way, and I'm a 4th year UVA. So I moved there because the street is really quaint, and it's also, at the time, it was affordable. Now, they've raised my rent by 1/3 from last year to this year, which is unfortunate, but it's still roughly comparable with other on the more affordable end units near the university. And I think that this new building would not follow the 2 reasons why I picked Montebello. I don't think that an 8-story building is very quaint. I am the owner of the deteriorating deck. I live on the upper floor. And I like the building. You know, it's got some problems, but I think that an 8-story building with a glazed front is not very quaint, and it doesn't fit with the neighborhood. So I would support Ellen's recommendation to keep it to 5 stories. And also I moved for, as I said, for the price. And if this is doing the in lieu pricing for affordable housing, I don't think that that would allow me to continue living in my residence. And also, a correction, the units are, it's a 3-unit apartment for all of them, and more than 3 people can live there. So, thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right. Still don't see anyone in our virtual audience. In-person audience, gentlemen?
Hello, my name is Mo Vandesample. I live at 608 Cabell Avenue. I am a graduate student with the economics department at the university. My rent currently takes up more than half of my monthly income. Charlottesville's tenants are being choked by a lack of adequate supply. And at the end of the day, that's all it is, supply and demand. A choice to vote down increases in density is a vote to make it harder for students to afford their rent. There's no two other ways about it. Referring to increasing student housing as a student ghetto is astonishingly racist and also extremely insensitive to the fact that Charlottesville's students are a big part of Charlottesville's community. The fact that we are trying to build more houses in this neighborhood is obviously a thing that is going to attempt to decrease car traffic all around Charlottesville, because students that can live close enough to the university to walk to it are students that do not require cars to get to the university otherwise. I know this for a fact because I do it. A lot of students can't afford cars and would really like to be able to walk, but are forced to because there is not adequate student housing near the universities. Voting down this proposal is exclusively a vote against low-income students and a vote for increasing the wealth of the already wealthy homeowners that sit on land that is extremely valuable. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Any additional speakers? All right. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Eva. I'm also a resident at 1709. And I just wanted to kind of speak on behalf of the future tenants of the, which I'm assuming will be made bigger apartment complex. Right now, parking is a problem. And I know, like you said, we do want to live in a world where students can just like walk to school and stuff. But a lot of us are still from Charlottesville. We have jobs, we drive places. Like honestly, going to like Barracks to get groceries and stuff is benefits if you have a car, and a lot of students do have cars. And the parking they're suggesting is simply inadequate for the increased density that they're asking for. My roommates have gotten parking tickets because they've been parking at their house. So I just want that to be noted, that I feel like the parking would be a problem. And as people said, the streets are getting very full of cars. So I think just like reworking that would have to be something you think about. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Anyone in our virtual audience? All right. How about our in-person audience? Do we have any other speakers in our in-person audience?
Right, that ends the public hearing. Mr. Palmer, any thoughts, comments, other deliberations?
I'll try to be like kind of high level with mine and allow you guys to get into the details. I think from what we've seen, you know, obviously it's good location for student housing. It's really close to the university and all that. I think from the standpoint of this conversation about like parking on Montebello versus not, I mean, I don't know what the right answer is other than to say I think as a good steward or good neighbor, I think focusing not just parking but deliveries and loading and unloading on JPA should be a goal of the project. I mean, I understand the occasional needing to load or unload on Montebello, but I don't see a whole lot of reason you couldn't do it off of JPA, assuming this building has an elevator and all that. Anyway, I think then Montebello works, that side works better for, bikes and peds and putting as much of that kind of parking in use up there. You're already at a higher point, so if you're walking or biking, it's much easier to get to grounds that way, which could be a benefit. I'm kind of not sure how I feel about the height, whether it's too high or too low. I understand, how the parking kind of drives, if the higher it is, the more people are going to live there, and you're still kind of constrained by those 19 parking spots. And how does that, work in the real world, I think is what we're hearing is probably an issue. So leave that there, and I look forward to hearing your all's thoughts on the affordability conundrum, versus, given what we know about what's coming versus what exists and how an SUP fits into that conversation.
You ready to come back, or you got a thought? Phil, you have a thought?
To his specific point?
No, just in general.
Well, it kind of is. I mean, kind of is to that point. So consistency being the hobgoblin of a small mind. Last time this came forward, I was with the concern about height and the future, this exact question about the picking and choosing. I was concerned about, again, picking and choosing what is presumably going to be in the new ordinance, should it eventuate, as opposed to following the current rules and trying to sort of thread that needle. This is a little different in that they're not really trying to play that balance in the same way. But I do tend to agree that density period is going to pull on the affordability issue, as one of the speakers said. The more units you have closer to the university, the tighter that is, and that also tends to relieve pressure elsewhere. So I'm not sure getting bogged down in the 2 extra stories in this case makes, really is something to have a battle about. Although I'm persuadable, I think I'm persuadable. Yeah, so I think that's where I'm going with the affordability, and we do have the payment in lieu. As much as we wince every time we talk about it, we have it. So that's sort of my initial thought on that piece.
I think as we heard, and as Bill and Phil just said, the kind of 2 to 3 issues that I think that are trying to wrestle with are the parking on Montebello and the parking requirements, as well as the affordable housing. Going with the cash in lieu option always gives me heartburn, and I'd always prefer if the units were actually provided on site, and if you're going for an SUP, it's more than the bare minimum. And the height on Montebello. I hear what the residents were saying. For the parking, I'm looking at the picture of Montebello right now, and there's, there are cars all up and down on that street, and it's a double-edged sword, because if parking is inadequate, and if students do have cars, then I kind of lean towards having them have the 3 parking spots that are on their own property to help alleviate some of that, so residents aren't parking on the street illegally, or having to impact parking elsewhere in the city. We keep hearing about parking infrastructure all the time, and if they're able to provide more, then I'm not sure I will say no to it.
Ooh, you are comfortable with that being there on Montebello, is that what you're saying?
Yes. And I'm still not sure how I feel about the affordable housing piece.
There is no new zoning. Legally, the zoning we have is the zoning we have. I'm a big believer in changing our zoning. I see serious problems with our current zoning. I have for many years. We have the zoning we have. Considering the code that we have, I see good and bad in this. I am concerned about payment in lieu. I don't think it's adequate. I don't think we've been given decent tools by the state on that issue. I wish it were better. It's not. It's not yet. Given the zoning we have and the proposal we have, I see a lot of good.
On that point, or on the affordable housing, let's start with that. I don't have any problem with a payment in lieu, for a project like this. Yeah, it's the amount that seems inadequate by by the adopted affordable housing plan and by the imminent, hopefully soon to be adopted standards we will have under the tools that we have been given by the state and have not implemented for nearly 3 years now, over 3 years now. So, I'd like to see that be improved. I was a little bit confused by what the applicant was indicating with regard to their intentions regarding that earlier. With regard to form, I think as presented from JPA, it's entirely appropriate. I worry about that garage entrance. I think the continuous sidewalk where you don't have a curb cut that a pedestrian or someone in a wheelchair has to navigate significantly mitigates that. I think on the Montebello side, it presents as a 3.5-story building. It's a 3-story building with a large setback on the fourth. It hits the same height as the house across the street. I think it's entirely appropriate. I think it's, nothing would stop you under the existing ordinance from filling that in and building a 3.5-story house across the street that would look larger than that. As for the parking, I'm a bit torn. The parking on Montebello, actually a bit surprised to see. To an extent, mixed messages. But usually we have neighbors demanding more parking, and I'm surprised to see people wanting to get rid of it. And I'm generally sympathetic to that. I think, to Mr. Wade's point, there would be a lot of value in having a scooter corral on the top. And bike parking as well. Having that gravitational potential energy so you don't have to get up that hill, especially for your tenants that might be engineers, going to Engineers Row. I personally would want to take the elevator up and go out by that entrance. There isn't exactly room for that now with that parking situation, or maybe there is, I don't know. I don't see the screening addition as strictly an improvement. I think right now, if you walk down Montebello, you see these buildings, all these apartment buildings, not presenting kind of a front door, and it's sort of an afterthought. They're sunk down, they're a story or sometimes less. I don't think that's an appropriate way to address the street. I think this proposal addresses it as a front door with a small driveway. I think if it could be shrunk down to 2 spaces and that would still work for a loading zone in front of them, I think that would be great. But I'm not, given, the needs of the people inside the building, that some people do want parking still, I'm not inclined to force them to remove them at this time.
So I'm in agreement with the concerns about the amount of the cash in lieu option. Similarly with the massing, we're not looking at our new zoning code, or potential new zoning code that's coming up, but at the same time, that zoning code would allow 5 stories on JPA and 5 stories up on Montebello. They could easily split the building. So that actually doesn't. This would be better than that, and as Rory said, it's a 3.5-story building on Montebello. Do we need to memorialize the step backs? That's, I guess, a question for all of you guys, because I don't see that in the conditions, but they definitely have a step back on both JPA and on Montebello. it does seem, to me, the massing seems appropriate. It makes sense to put height on JPA. Not to go any higher than what this is currently proposing on Montebello, but I think this could certainly be appropriate. As for parking, I'm a little torn, but I do feel like if they're going to build the building anyways without the parking, all it's doing is creating more demand for services that, you know, people who don't have cars can use. And I think if we're ever going to get past that threshold where, you know, people can choose not to have a car in the city, we have to have enough people who need services, who can't have a car, if that makes any sense, to get the services that, you know, grocery stores, better transit, things like that, get over those, the critical mass to allow those things to actually happen. So I would be okay with eliminating the 3 parking spots. It does make sense to have some sort of loading zone up there, though, because that seems to always be an afterthought where a truck just ends up in the street. So I think we do need to be careful about making sure that we don't force a condition where somebody's just blocked off the street by unloading in the middle of it. The S3 zoning, I agree with Rory that it doesn't make sense to, it definitely doesn't make sense to allow a opaque wall between the street, between Montebello and this building. And I'm not sure that a super dense vegetative screen makes sense either. Again, for the idea that, you know, we seem to be pushing in our new zoning code, or our proposed zoning code, pushing the idea of having eyes on the street and having a front door and all that. And it's putting a wall between the building and even a vegetative wall between the building and Montebello just doesn't seem to make any sense. So cram all the street trees in there that they possibly can. I'm all for that, but I'm not sure that it makes sense to fully screen it off. And I'm fine with the applicant's request to change condition 11 concerning the LID worksheet.
Righty, a couple of easy ones. I am completely, well, I don't completely, but I'm very comfortable with recommendation number 9, which eliminates parking, and also I believe eliminates loading on Montebello. I can be convinced that loading might be something we ought to give way to, but the parking in Montebello, I think recommendation number 9 is right on target. The payment in lieu, I think, is ideal for this part of the city, but I don't think it's enough. I would like to see more. I'm not sure there's anything we can do about the amount right now. It is what it is, but for the university area, payment in lieu seems to be reasonable. Mr. Helfley, can you walk us through number 11, recommendation number 11, and what the applicant would like to do, and tell us what we think?
So just for a little clarification, I think there's some confusion on the LID worksheet, and I'll touch base with that. Getting to the code requires, when you do an SUP, requires an LID worksheet, low impact development. For an SUP, there aren't any number requirements. It just is a required document that you fill out, but you do not have to meet a number threshold. For infill SUPs, you have to reach the 10-point threshold. So I think there's one of the points of confusion for clarification. This body has had many SUPs in front of it where your LID checklist is 0. We've had very few infill SUPs in front of this body, but that's where that 10 comes from. So what staff was trying to do was just memorialize what was in the application. Staff has really no concern with what the applicant wants to change it to. Trying to do shared parking, reduced parking, it comes out to like 3 spaces they would need to share to meet how I interpret the LID checklist for the shared parking. So changing that to what they're proposing, I don't have a concern. I do think they should meet the green roof or biofilter, as it's also being called out in the critical slope waiver.
Thanks. Right, what would we like to do with this? No, I'm not going up there. I'm not going to the other dais. So what would we like to do with this?
Well,
So, on the, I think to best play our role as the planning commission in giving advice, I'm inclined to defer to council to play hardball or bad cop on the amount of the in lieu payment, so that we can give them a general recommendation, including, you know, on these items of contention. And then, you know, I think we got the point across. I think everyone has seen the draft inclusionary zoning ordinance, and I expect that they'll probably go to council and say something else than they've presented us. But I would like to give an affirmative recommendation, including on some recommendation on those three things. And I'm not sure I tallied up.
Would you like to structure a motion so that we can deliberate around your motion?
Yeah, I was going to propose maybe straw polls on how we felt about each of those, because I didn't write it as we did, but
well, we can work on it as we deliberate. So give us a
Sure.
motion, we'll work on it.
Yep. Give me one moment here. Let's see. No, I don't have it. Right here. I move to recommend approval of this application for a special use permit in the R3 zone at 160010100 and an address of 1709 Jefferson Park Avenue to permit additional density with the following conditions. The 11 conditions listed by staff, less condition 11, with an added condition for a continuous sidewalk at the vehicular entry on the JPA frontage, and then a replacement condition 11. The applicant shall implement measures in the city's low impact development worksheet to achieve a minimum of 10 points. The applicant's checklist, page 8 of the application and sheet 36 of the application materials, notes a combination of shared parking, bioretention, and/or green rooftop. However, other measures from the checklist may be substituted with approval from city engineering if the measures indicated become impractical as the project develops.
Is there a second so we can begin deliberations?
Second.
All right, second, just so that you know, what you just did is you took out the parking and you also took out the loading. Because condition number 9 takes out the parking and loading. Just want to make sure you guys are aware of that. Which I'm comfortable with.
And now we can argue over it.
I want to make sure you guys are aware of what you just suggested.
Was there a second?
Yes, it was. Mr. Bob.
All right, so I guess to structure the conversation, I would propose an amendment to the motion to remove condition 9.
You want to move all of condition 9 or just the loading part? Because I think we have consensus that parking's not a good idea back there, but we don't have consensus at loading.
I heard a few people say parking was a good idea.
Yeah.
Wait,
I'm okay with the parking.
I'm okay with the parking.
Or some parking and loading.
Was that, or anyone else? Was it just us two?
I'm not up with it. I'm down with the parking.
I'm generally agnostic on the parking, but I think that,
There's less parking than there is now.
but we're also dealing with, we've got, I feel like in some respects, we have the privilege of 2 front yards here, and if we can figure out some way to maximize that, or if the applicant can figure out a way to sort of maximize that, and they proposed one, so I don't really object to the parking being up there. I'm not sure what the logistics of that'll look like and who gets what parking spots, but, that's not our problem.
All right, we have a motion that has been amended. Is the commission willing to accept the amendment?
That's our second.
Well, I think, so what, we have 3, do we have any more? In parking?
LED, or no, some screening?
Yeah, we're just talking about parking,
Yeah,
right?
parking on Monticello. Mr. Helper, you want to inform us?
No, I'm not. I personally.
No, Mr. Helper.
Just as you're looking at this and you're taking recommendations on conditions, I also would just consider looking into at condition 6. Because if you don't alter that, that could impact parking ability if you want parking on Montebello.
And condition 8 too is effective in that, because that state's reducing it to 19 spaces.
Killing us. Yeah, though,
Correct, yeah, and condition 8 might need to be modified.
you could always still, oh,
Right.
well, it would need to be modified if we allowed the parking. Well, it wouldn't need to, because they could always do more than that.
All right, so do you want to, it's suggested that you need to modify 6, 8, and 9. Are those the ones you want to modify? And if you would like to modify them, how would you like to modify them?
All right, let's start with modifying 9 to remove the or loading. So to permit loading on the Montebello side.
Cool. Yes. Yes.
We got 1, 2,
You've got
3, 4.
You got 4 votes. Yes. Move on.
4 in favor.
So 8 can stay how it is in that case.
Well,
I think it could stay how it is required. Why would it?
okay, so, and then to modify 9 to allow parking, which I guess would be eliminating 9. We've got 3 opposed to that, 3 who want to ban parking.
I know you got 1. I don't know if you got more than 1.
2.
I was for removing parking.
Removing
Yeah,
parking,
so, yeah.
removing parking.
I'd like to see less parking.
So we got 3 to 3.
All right,
Take it out. I mean,
I'm not
leave it
super.
in there.
I'm not super strongly on
Leave it in there, and we'll give you the parking. I mean, we'll give you the
the
loading
bike
part.
parking.
Yeah, the loading.
Oh, and the loading, yeah. And I'm inclined maybe to mandate some bike or scooter parking up there if we're getting rid of all that anyway. And honestly, I kind of feel like the S3 buffer is a little strong.
All right, you're meandering here.
Yeah, well, so
give Ms.
relation.
Creasy the verbiage you'd like to have for number 9, please.
Well, so for number 9, I think the verbiage we've landed on now with that amendment is on-site vehicular parking on-site vehicular parking shall not be permitted within the Montebello Circle yards or right-of-way.
Okay. All right, so that's number 9, Ms. Creasy.
Or right-of-way. Yeah.
Okay.
And then I think now we have this problem of 6 that says alter the landscape buffer within the Montebello Circle yard to 18 feet wide along 90% of the frontage. Landscape buffer shall be S3 as defined in the zoning section. S3. Mr. Alfie, do you have a recommendation for how that might be modified to accommodate a loading zone and scooter parking?
My recommendation would be to change the percentage. Staff, I think, would still stick with the S3. S3 doesn't necessarily mean they have to do an opaque wall. It just gives the director the option if a design at the site plan level is appropriate. I think you can cut down the percentage that screening needs to take up. 50 or 60% would probably be adequate to allow for things like scooter parking, your loading zone, but still allow then that percentage to take up screening for the rest of not being
Mr.
used.
Stolzenberg, is 50% acceptable?
Can I ask a question on that?
Sure.
But the S3's screening, although the actual physical wall that's not vegetated, but a built wall is an option, the screening is still meant to be opaque in a sense, like it's still hedges and whatnot.
It is, if Planning Commission feels they're looking more to engage the street and they don't want to cut it off, S1 or S2 would be appropriate. Just be aware that just leaves the planting option. There isn't an option for a wall under the S1 or S2.
I'd be more for not having a wall and just planting. I don't know why we'd want to have a wall between the road and.
I mean, I would be for just having street trees.
Yeah, which is required, right? And not, well, and those requirements for trees,
I don't know if they are required in that same way.
Ms. Galfley?
Yeah, I just, you do want to consider some type of screening because the code requires in that separation between these two different uses, it talks about a screen separation. So in altering that requirement, you do want to consider a screening. I wouldn't just leave it blank because that's going to default back to the code screening requirement.
and is that code not really intended, is it also intended to include across a street?
75 feet from facade to low-density residential.
All right. What do you think, Carl? S1 or S2?
Looks like a lot of folks are saying too.
I mean, I'm thinking.
You guys looking at the pictures?
One, because it's S1 buffer screen requires an open landscaping scheme, and is generally to be utilized between relatively similar land uses. Plantings allowed by the S1 designation consists of the following: understory trees, hedges, shrubs, large. It consists of any type of planting. But I don't. I wanted. Part of me wants to say a vegetative screen is not required, and then just tell them that they need to use street trees. But I don't know if that's.
If the body decides a screen's not required, I would just call it out. What you don't want to do is leave it ambiguous to say 75 feet. But if you're reducing that requirement per this code section, I would spell it out that screening's not required, so you don't fall.
And the consequences of doing that would be what?
Of not screening,
Yeah.
I mean, you still would need to do street trees, but the code calls out, as the code's written, it calls out 75 feet, and it talks about screening. I don't have the code in front of me, I can't think of the screening number, but it is calling out a separation from facade to low-density residential that is planted with additional plantings. So what I'm just getting at is if you're reducing the separation, I also would address the screening, I think, by saying no screening requirement is appropriate if that's what this body wants to do, but you just need to call it out.
And I think where Carl and I are running into concerns is that, a landscape screen is a little bit different than, a landscape front yard and tree trees. It's to some extent the same things, trees and some bushes, but with the intent of obscuring rather than, being a front yard. Which, to be fair, as mentioned, a lot of the homes on the street do have a fair amount of screening as their front yard landscaping. And so with that, well,
How much of the, if we were to remove the screening requirement, how much of the landscaping are we allowed to pick at as part of the entrance corridor review?
I think Mr. Warner would suggest that most of it's going to be a part of the interest.
well, the tricky part is it's not visible at all from JPA.
Yeah.
I think one problem you have is up at the top at Montebello, there's a power line going overhead. And then you have an extremely steep slope and kind of a slender side yard. So, but I mean, you all have, there are the tree cover requirements that are already in the ordinance. There's a certain amount of trees that are going to go there regardless. I don't know, I'm looking at the top of that hill from a different view than maybe a design and saying, what are the limitations of what you can put there?
Those power lines are going to be a problem no matter what. How are we going to deal with that?
So, but I'd say from an entrance corridor perspective, this is top of the hill behind the building. Does it technically something you have to address? You certainly can, but.
Yeah, all right. I mean, I'm willing to say something like at least an S1 screen.
Okay.
If that
All right,
works
give
for you guys.
give Ms. Creasy an idea of what you'd like recommendation 6 to look like.
So, alter the landscape buffer within the Montebello Circle yard to 18 feet wide along 50% of the liner frontage. Landscape buffer shall be at least S1 as defined in zoning section 34-871.
Yeah, we are willing to accept that.
Affirmation on that?
Yeah. Good.
All right, and then any interest in mandating outdoor bicycle storage or scooter corral up there?
Doesn't bother me a bit.
I'd like to hear from the applicant if that's okay, what their thoughts are.
You guys think you can work that in?
I'm sorry.
Bikes and scooters up top.
Yeah, we agree. Okay, right.
And you're not already planning on doing that indoors there, right? That would only be downstairs.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of the main bike storage would be inside. That's what we were planning anyway.
Yeah.
And scooters, honestly, we hadn't planned for, and so this conversation's been helpful there. We would like to find some room up top. It's true, a lot of people would be coming and going from that entrance.
Is that the conclusion of your motion?
There's one thing that Carl mentioned, the step backs.
Yes, yeah, I would like to add that the building should include these step backs at least as deep as are shown in the current application.
Ms. Creasy, does that make sense? Or do we need to repeat it?
Is there a specific drawing you're looking at?
I think they gave us a section. Let me.
Page 18.
Chair, I'd also like to ask the applicant if they have any concern with that being a requirement.
Yeah, it would be page 18 of their application, but yes, do you guys have any issues with that?
So I think we intend to put the step backs in. We would like a little bit of flexibility because once we get into construction documents and the structural components, we might need a little flexibility, just a foot or two in either direction, but we intend to.
I'm okay with some fuzzy language on that.
Substantially
Yeah.
similar?
Substantially, okay, that's good.
So do we, just to put some language on my bike thing, a condition to require short-term bicycle spaces and/or a micro-mobility corral on the Montebello Street, or Montebello Circle side, street-facing yard.
Like that?
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Ms. Creasy, are you in good shape?
All right, so here's where we are.
All right, guys. Please.
Okay, so all right, so we have the initial motion that was made and seconded that deleted this 11, added the new language 11, and then added a new condition that requires continuous raised sidewalk on the JPA frontage. All right, so that's our current motion. The amendments that were just mulled through, that I have, and y'all help me out, number 9 would just allow for loading, no parking.
Right.
Number 6 would lower the percentage of the buffer to 50%, and the landscape buffer would be at least S1, and incorporate a condition to require short-term bike parking and/or multimodal parking corral.
Yep.
And then a condition that notes that the building includes setbacks substantially in accord with the current proposal drawing on page 18.
Did you say setback or step back?
Step back, I have step here, yes,
Yeah.
step.
And plural, as I'm assuming, because
Step backs, that's what I, yeah, I
Okay,
didn't
good.
say that, but step backs is what I
And
actually
all
heard.
the amendments you just outlined have already been agreed to, so we are,
Okay, so,
that is the
so
motion.
let's formally have, the amended motion, accepted and seconded again by, Rory and
Well,
Mr.
Rory amended his own motion. Mr. Bob, you can second it.
Second.
Okay.
Hold on, one sec. It's a detail, but I think we said in what was just read out loud, multimodal corral, but I think the word was micromobility.
Micro-mobility, yeah.
Micro-mobility, sorry about that.
Thank you. All
Seconded
right, so we've got a second. Ms. Creasy, I think we're ready for the vote, aren't we?
Do we need to vote to amend the motion and then to approve?
We just did it.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman, I believe it would be appropriate to now cast a vote on the amendment.
Okay.
If the amendment passes, that will be
Got it.
incorporated into the underlying motion. It would be appropriate then to vote on the motion. So-
Would you hold the board, Ms. Creasy, on the
Sure.
amendment?
All right, so this is specific to the amendment we're adding for 9, 6, and the step backs.
11.
And 11.
11 was already built.
11's already included
Well,
in the main
we're
motion.
using the applicant's language as opposed to our language.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. All right. So on that amendment, I will call Mr. Schwartz,
Yes.
Mr. Durancio,
Aye.
Mr. Stolzenberg,
Aye.
Mr. Habab,
Aye.
Mr. Sully Yates,
Aye.
And Mr. Mitchell.
Yes.
All right, so you all have a amendment that incorporates, or you have a motion that incorporates multiple amendments, including the update to 11, the new condition for the sidewalk JPA, number 9 updates, number 6 updates, and then the step back in substantial.
And we have a motion that was made by Mr. Stolzenberg and a second made by Mr. Habab. Ms. Creasy, I think you're ready to poll the board now on the...
Sure. Mr. Schwartz?
Yes.
Mr. Duranzio?
Aye.
Mr. Stolzenberg?
Aye.
Mr. Habab?
Aye.
Mr. Sola Yates?
Aye.
And Mr. Mitchell?
Yes.
All right.
All right, we will now move on to deliberations regarding the critical slope.
Yes.
And I'll begin with that. It seems pretty, even for me, and I usually dive into these pretty deeply, but it seems pretty straightforward. But I'll start with Mr. Palmer. Any issues with the critical slope?
No, I don't have an issue. I mean, you look at the site, the purpose is to improve the environment, and they're adding a lot less, well, I don't know if it's less impermeability, but we're seeing a much better landscape as an outcome.
Mr. Duranzio.
Wave away.
Same.
Makes sense.
I mean, I guess one question, we talk about conditions to require bioretention or green rooftop. And then we had just changed it to be 10 points from either of those or others. Are we okay with keeping the same language, Mr. Alfley?
Staff's preference would be to keep the same language as in the staff report, as it more relates directly to the critical slope application.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm impressed by how much treatment they're doing.
Mr. Schwartz. Anything?
No concerns.
Is there a motion? Mr. Duranzio.
Hold on, let me try and... I'm on the wrong page.
I move to recommend approval of the critical slope waiver for tax map and parcels 160010100 as requested, with conditions based on, I can do both findings? Based on both findings, number 1 and 2. The public benefits of allowing the disturbance outweigh the benefits afforded by the existing undisturbed critical slope per 341120B6D1, and due to unusual physical conditions or the existing development of the property, compliance with the city's critical slope regulations would prohibit or unreasonably restrict the use or development of the property per section 34-1120B6D2, with the following conditions listed in the staff report.
Second.
Ms. Creasy.
All right, I have a motion that's been seconded. Are you ready to call for the vote? Okay. Mr. Schwartz?
Yes.
Mr. Duranzio?
Aye.
Mr. Stolzenberg?
Aye.
Mr. Habab?
Aye.
Mr. Sola Yates?
Aye.
And Mr. Mitchell?
Hey. Alrighty, I think, Ms. Creasy, we are ready to go back to matters to be presented by the public, not on the formal agenda. All right, this is an opportunity for the public to talk to us about the work that we do that will not necessarily relate to JPA. So if there's anything you'd like to talk to us about relating to the work we do, please. And Ms. Creasy, I'll ask you to moderate. We have
Sure. All right, so matters from the public, the same allowance for 3 minutes to speak on any issue except for the JPA issue that we just heard. And so we will start with our in-person audience, and then we'll move to our virtual audience. Do we have any in-person audience? Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. Kay Slaughter, 1503 Short 18th Street in the city. I'm a downstream riparian landowner near the project on Zero East High. State code and local law require your review of the current project on East High for conformity to the city's comprehensive plan, as you noted, that was approved by your commission. This includes transportation facilities, the streets, the public parking lot, and the public parking lot. The proposed resolution states that the widening of Caroline Street and Fairway Avenue, including new sidewalks, would meet the goals of the comp plan to improve public access to the Rivanna River trails and the transit stops. However, the expansion would violate Transportation Strategy 7.1 of the comp plan that speaks specifically to transportation projects' impacts on the floodplains and other sensitive resources. 7.1 states that the city should, quote, ensure transportation projects are sited and designed to avoid sensitive environmental resources and natural resiliency features such as floodplains, stream buffers, and wetlands, end of quote. Other documents further support this approach. Widening Caroline and Fairway and building sidewalks are transportation projects under 7.1. This new impervious surface will exacerbate flooding within the floodplain, wetlands, and stream buffers of the Rivanna, and also those adjoining Mead Creek, which is adjacent to the property and which goes under Fairway Avenue. Caroline and Fairway both already have traffic signs warning drivers and pedestrians, street may flood, and it does. Like streets A and B, Caroline and Fairway are transportation projects not in conformance with the comprehensive plan. I urge you to amend your motion to find that none of these designated roads are in compliance with section 7.1 of the city comprehensive plan. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, to our virtual audience, if anyone is interested in speaking during matters from the public, this is the opportunity to raise your hand in the Zoom application. I don't see any hands raised at this time. I'll go to our in-person audience and see if we have any other speakers. I don't see any speakers in the audience, either virtual or in person. Chair?
All right, that ends our public comment on that section.
Chair, we also have the matters, or not matters, but consent agenda to consider at some point this evening.
Thank you. Let's do that.
All right.
Thank you. Is there a motion to?
I move that we approve the consent agenda with the one edit to the minutes to correct the spelling of my name, but otherwise fine.
Second.
Ms. Creasy.
Sure. Let's see. All right, Mr. Schwartz,
Yes.
Mr. Durazio,
Aye.
Mr. Stolzenberg,
Aye.
Mr. Habab,
Aye.
Mr. Sully Yates,
Aye.
and Mr. Mitchell.
Was not at the March 8th meeting, so on that one I will abstain. On the June meeting, aye. Ms. Creasy, make sure I'm tracking this correctly, but I think we've only got one more item, and then any discussion on the zoning ordinance. Zero High Street is the only thing we've got left?
Yes.
Okay. I guess we can power through. I was going to ask for a break, but we can power through. Yes, power through.
Yes. Keep going.
Ms. Rainey.
Good evening, Carrie Rainey with Neighborhood Development Services. On August 8th, the Planning Commission held a public hearing and reviewed public facilities associated with the Zero East High project pursuant to Virginia Code Section 15.2-2232 and City Code Section 34-28. to determine if the general character, approximate location, and extent of the proposed facilities was substantially in accordance with the city's adopted comprehensive plan. Following the public hearing, the Planning Commission took a vote on this matter. Virginia code requires that the commission communicate its findings to City Council, indicating its approval or disapproval with written reasons for its decision. Therefore, a resolution has been provided in your packet for your consideration tonight, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
No. Mr. Hub, Mr. Yates, Mr. Stosenberg, Mr. Schwartz. Mr. Mayor, any questions about the resolution? Is Mr. Payne over there? Is it? Any questions about the resolution?
Not at this time. I guess just a procedural question, just to refresh my memory, what would be the process in terms of after Planning Commission takes a vote? What happens after that?
That would be for staff.
Mr. Sturman would like to provide a response.
What's that?
So Councilor Payne, as you were, we have received 2 appeals, and so once these findings are, once the Planning Commission acts on these findings, those would be delivered to council, and given the timing constraints of the Code of Virginia, we would anticipate recommending that council take up both appeals at its first meeting in October.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would anyone like to suggest a motion so that we can continue our deliberations?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion.
Mr. Soliates.
I would like to propose that we pass the language as presented in the staff packet.
Seconded.
We have a second. Any further discussion? Mr. Stolzenberg.
I guess just for the record, if I had been here last month, I would have found Public Road A to be in conformance with the comprehensive plan. I find that defining as a dead end road when it connects to a new paved trail, that it's important micromobility, multimodal, transportation corridor is inappropriate and automobile centric, and that it's not a dead end road. It, in fact, is part of the important transportation connection that we found that the, I believe it's Lot A trail would be.
Any other thoughts? All right, we have a motion that has been properly seconded. Is there, Ms. Creasy, ready to hold the board?
Sure. Mr. Schwartz?
Yes.
Mr. Duranzia?
Aye.
Mr. Stolzenberg?
No.
Mr. Habab?
Aye.
Mr. Mitchell?
Yes.
And Mr. Soliates?
Aye.
Ms. Creasy and/or Mr. Freeze, is there an update regarding next steps? Or have we already gone through that? Next steps on the zoning ordinance.
Yep.
I think the only update I'd provide is the one we all know, that we have the Planning Commission associating a public hearing on this item on Thursday, beginning at 4 p.m. Ms. Creasy already went over some great deal of detail on the process associated with that coming up, and we look forward to hearing from the public and from all of you.
All right. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Yes, sir. I would just like to note that September 12th is the accepted anniversary of the Battle of Marathon, which is an appropriate thing to end on as we prepare for Thursday, and I suggest that we stay hydrated.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Good night.
Saw that Sam's gained some speed.